Picture the interior of a diesel submarine, hundreds of feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
The date is October 27, 1962. And inside this steel tube, the temperature has climbed above, 110 degrees.
It's essentially an oven.
Exactly. The air conditioning systems have completely failed. Men are quietly passing out of their stations from carbon dioxide poisoning. And above them, the ocean is just exploding.
American destroyers are actively dropping depth charges.
Yeah, dropping depth charges that literally rattled the teeth in the sailors' skulls. And the submarine has been cut off from all radio contact with Moscow for days.
Which means,
for all the men inside know, the surface of the Earth has already been reduced to radioactive ash. They think World War III has begun.
That's the only logical conclusion they could draw in the dark.
Right. So the captain of this vessel, exhausted and genuinely convinced his country is already dead, gives an order. He orders his men to arm a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo and prepare to fire it at the American fleet above.
Yeah.
His political officer formally agrees. 2 of the 3 men required to authorize a nuclear strike have turned their keys.
Only 1 man is left.
Yeah.
The flotilla commander, he is sweating in the dark, listening to the explosions. He looks at his captain and he refuses to give his authorization. He says no.
That single word, spoken quietly in a suffocating metal tube. It's the only reason you and I are sitting here tonight, the only reason you, the listener tuning into this conversation right now, were ever even born.
It's sobering.
It really is. The history books we read in high school neatly package the Cold War as this, grand geopolitical standoff, a chess match of ideologies between capitalism and communism that just sort of ended with the peaceful lowering of a flag in 1991.
A very sanitized narrative.
Highly sanitized.
Yeah.
Because when you step out of the classroom and walk into the archives, when you open the declassified files, that pristine image completely shatters.
It does. The documents reveal a historical landscape that is, frankly, deeply disturbing. The peace the world celebrated in 1945 was an illusion. It was built over a foundation of profound deception, sheer luck, and constant, terrifying near misses.
Okay, let's unpack this. Tonight, you are sitting in the room with us as we take a comprehensive, unvarnished look at the Cold War, from 1947 to 1991.
And we should clarify our sources here.
Yes, our sources for this deep dive are not the sanitized memoirs of politicians. We have a stack of declassified military records, internal intelligence memos, and hidden historical files.
The raw data.
The mission here is to look past the propaganda of both empires and examine the cover-ups, the lies, and the human beings who literally held the fate of the entire world in their hands. Because the official narrative says the Cold War began in 1947. But looking at these records, the true story begins with a monumental betrayal before the previous global war had even officially ended.
Well, to understand the 46 years of global paranoia that shaped the modern world, you have to examine the psychological state of the Allied powers in 1945. Right. The United States and the Soviet Union were bound together by the absolute necessity of destroying Nazi Germany. But alliances born of desperation rarely survive the victory.
They just don't.
No. The moment the German military collapsed, the fundamental, irreconcilable differences between Washington and Moscow became the only thing that mattered.
I want to look closely at those differing lenses, because the asymmetry is just striking.
Very much so.
The United States emerges from World War II in an unprecedented position. Their mainland is completely untouched by bombs.
Their industrial capacity has actually exploded during the war.
Exploded. They are looking at the post-war map and envisioning a global landscape of democratic free market nations. Open trade, rebuilt economies, a system inherently designed to favor American commerce and American values. It is a vision of global integration.
Now, contrast that with the reality on the ground in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's night and day.
They did not experience an economic boom. They experienced an apocalypse. The Soviet Union lost upwards of 27 million citizens fighting the Nazis.
27 million.
Entire generations of men were wiped out. Thousands of towns and villages were physically burned to the ground. So their vision for the post-war world was not about global free trade.
No.
It was about raw, physical survival. Stalin and the Soviet leadership looked at the flat geography of Eastern Europe, which is the traditional invasion route into Russia, and they made a definitive calculation. They demanded a human shield.
The buffer zone.
Exactly. They required communist-controlled buffer states stretching from Poland down to the Balkans to ensure no Western army could ever march on Moscow again.
So you have this fundamental collision course. One side demands open democratic markets, and the other demands closed, subjugated buffer zones for sheer physical security.
Right.
But the betrayal in the archives goes much deeper than incompatible philosophies. This is the detail that forces you to reevaluate the entire narrative.
The timeline of the planning.
The timeline. While civilians in New York and London and Moscow are still dancing in the streets, celebrating the Great Alliance that crushed fascism, the declassified files show that American military strategists were already drawing up detailed operational plans to fight the Soviet Union.
In the spring of 1945.
Yes, in the spring of 1945.
Yeah.
While the war in the Pacific was still raging.
The ink on the German surrender wasn't even dry. But military planners in Washington and London were looking at the sheer size of the Soviet Red Army occupying Eastern Europe, and they were calculating troop movements, supply lines, and logistical requirements to forcefully dismantle the very army that had just helped them win the war.
It's incredible.
They were engineering the next global conflict before the current one had concluded.
I look at that and think of it as a poison chalice.
The poison chalice, yeah.
The victory of World War II is inherently poisoned because the men signing the peace treaties were silently calculating how to destroy the men sitting across the table. But reading further into these intelligence files, I have to question the absolute hubris of the American and British planners.
How so?
Because while they were sitting in locked rooms, secretly plotting a future war against the Soviets, their own deepest secrets were actively being handed over to Moscow.
What's fascinating here is the sheer velocity of the intelligence hemorrhage.
Yeah.
The traditional narrative suggests a slow descent into espionage over the 1950s. The archival reality is that the infiltration was immediate and absolute.
And at the highest levels.
The highest. Take the case of H.A.R. Kim Philby. He was a senior British intelligence official. In fact, he was the specific liaison charged with coordinating the earliest Anglo-American counter-espionage efforts against the Soviet Union.
Just to be clear on the mechanics of his access, for everyone listening, Philby isn't just a low-level analyst copying files in a basement.
No, not at all.
He is sitting in the most sensitive, restricted strategy meetings in London and Washington. He is literally the man the Americans are consulting to figure out how to build their spy networks.
And Kim Philby was a deeply committed Soviet asset.
Yeah.
Every single meeting he attended, every strategic objective discussed with his American counterparts, he committed to memory or photographed. That information was then routed straight back to Moscow.
Unbelievable.
So the Americans are meticulously planning a future war, completely unaware that their classified strategies are sitting on desks in the Kremlin, translated into Russian almost in real time.
It is a staggering failure of counterintelligence. But the American military leadership at that exact moment in 1945 believed they were untouchable.
Because of the bomb?
Because of the bomb.
Okay.
They possessed the ultimate trump card. They had successfully built and deployed atomic bombs, erasing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing over 200,000 people in flashes of light.
Right.
Looking at this devastating new physical reality, the American leadership convinced themselves they held a permanent monopoly.
They genuinely believed the underlying physics and the massive industrial engineering required to enrich uranium would take the decimated Soviet state at least a decade to replicate.
A full decade.
They believed the sheer complexity of the science was an insurmountable moat. They fundamentally underestimated Soviet scientific capability, but more fatally, they underestimated the vulnerability of the Manhattan Project itself. They did not have a decade of nuclear supremacy.
No.
They had precisely 4 years.
4 years. In August 1949, the Soviet Union successfully detonated their first nuclear device, codenamed First Lightning.
Yeah.
And the shockwaves that tore through the Pentagon were absolute, because the realization dawned very quickly that the Soviets did not arrive at this through independent trial and error.
They bypassed the trial and error because they stole the blueprints.
Stole them completely.
The central figure in this was Klaus Fuchs, a brilliant theoretical physicist who had been embedded at the highest levels of the British and American nuclear programs.
Right.
Fuchs was a communist sympathizer. Throughout his time working at Los Alamos, the heavily guarded laboratory where the bomb was designed, he was methodically passing precise mathematical calculations, dimensions, and schematics to Soviet couriers.
He handed them the exact dimensions of the plutonium core.
Exactly.
And the escalation that follows the breaking of that monopoly is something the human brain just struggles to properly conceptualize.
It scales too fast.
It does. We talk about atomic bombs, which function on nuclear fission splitting the atom. But by 1953, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed hydrogen bombs, which utilized nuclear fusion. We are no longer talking about kilotons of force. We're talking about megatons.
To put the physics into perspective, a hydrogen bomb uses a traditional atomic bomb simply as the trigger.
Just the trigger.
Just to initiate a fusion reaction, briefly creating the conditions found at the center of the sun. The destructive yield is hundreds, sometimes thousands of times more powerful than the weapon that destroyed Hiroshima.
It's almost unimaginable.
The shift in military strategy was profound. A nation no longer needed thousands of bombers to destroy an enemy's industrial capacity. A single warhead could erase a major metropolitan area and permanently alter the regional climate.
And the delivery systems evolve at the exact same terrifying pace.
Right.
By the late 1950s, aerospace engineering gives us the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, the ICBM. You no longer need to fly a slow, vulnerable bomber across the ocean.
No, you just turn a key.
You turn a key, and a missile exits the atmosphere, re-enters at hypersonic speeds, and strikes any coordinates on the globe in under 30 minutes.
The development of the ICBM fundamentally alters the nature of human existence. The entire global population was suddenly living under the permanent, daily condition of mutually assured destruction.
With less than half an hour's warning. Which introduces a completely paralyzing geopolitical logic. Once you reach the point of mutually assured destruction, open warfare between the two superpowers becomes impossible.
Right, because nobody wins.
Exactly. You cannot launch a tank invasion into West Germany if the inevitable result is the thermonuclear vaporization of Washington, D.C. and Moscow. The conflict cannot be fought on a traditional battlefield. It is forced to go underground.
This raises an important question regarding the domestic environment of the United States during this transition. To fight an underground war, a government must build an underground apparatus.
A shadow state.
And
the contrast between the public reality and the classified reality in America in the 1950s is deeply unsettling.
Very.
If you are an ordinary citizen, you are living the idealized post-war life. The economy is booming, you are moving to the newly built suburbs, buying a television, raising a family behind a literal white picket fence.
The American dream.
Yes, the American dream. And completely hidden from your view, your government is executing operations that completely betray the moral high ground they claim to be defending on the global stage. I want to look specifically at the mechanics of Operation Paperclip.
Operation Paperclip was a classified intelligence program in which the United States government secretly recruited and brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America immediately following the collapse of the Third Reich.
1,600.
Over 1,600, yes.
I find myself wrestling heavily with the moral abyss of this operation.
It's bleak.
We are not talking about low-level mechanics who were drafted into the regular German army. We are talking about high-ranking members of the Nazi Party, men who managed the underground V-2 rocket facilities like Mittelwerk, where tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners were literally worked to death in unspeakable conditions.
And the U.S. government quietly scrubs their dossiers.
Scrubs them clean, gives them new identities, and installs them in comfortable laboratories in Texas and Alabama.
Well, the strategic logic of the military intelligence officers who authorized this was cold and purely utilitarian. They looked at the geopolitical chessboard. They knew the Soviets were aggressively capturing their own German scientists.
Right.
So the American rationale was that the technical knowledge locked inside the minds of these men, specifically regarding rocketry and aerodynamics, was absolutely vital for national survival in the coming conflict.
Survival trumps ethics.
In their minds, yes. They determined that acquiring this expertise outweighed any obligation to seek justice for the victims of the Holocaust.
It is the ultimate moral compromise. America is publicly positioning itself as the shining beacon of democracy, fighting a global war of ideals against a totalitarian, oppressive communist regime. Yet behind closed doors, to build better missiles to fight that war, they are eagerly employing literal war criminals.
Yeah.
And the deception wasn't isolated to who they were putting on the payroll. It extended to what they were doing in the airspace over the Soviet Union.
The U-2 spy plane program perfectly illustrates the depth of that deception.
Let's get into the U-2.
The U-2 was an extraordinary piece of engineering designed to fly at altitudes exceeding 70,000 feet far above the reach of Soviet radar and surface-to-air missiles of the early 1950s. The CIA used these planes to conduct highly illegal, covert reconnaissance flights deep into sovereign Soviet airspace.
They were photographing military installations to map out the Soviet nuclear infrastructure.
Exactly.
And the Soviet leadership knew they were there.
They could see the blips on their radar screens.
Right. But for years, they didn't have the technology to shoot them down or intercept them. They were forced to watch in silent humiliation. Meanwhile, the United States government, all the way up to President Dwight D. Eisenhower, categorically and vehemently denied that any such flights were taking place.
They lied to the American public, and they lied to the United Nations.
Just flat out lies.
And that illusion held until May 1st, 1960. Soviet missile technology had finally caught up. A U-2 plane, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was struck by the shockwave of a surface-to-air missile over Sverdlovsk.
And he survived.
Powers survived, bailed out, and was captured alive. And the wreckage of the plane, complete with its espionage cameras, was recovered.
And Eisenhower, assuming the pilot had died and the plane was destroyed, issues another forceful public denial, claiming it was just a weather plane that had drifted off course.
Right.
The Soviets then produced a living pilot and the camera equipment on the world stage. The lie is completely exposed.
It was a disaster.
The inherent trust the American public placed in the absolute truthfulness of the presidency suffered a permanent fracture. But the manipulation of truth wasn't just directed at foreign adversaries or international bodies. The archive's detail operations directed squarely at the American citizens themselves.
We must examine Operation Mockingbird.
Yes.
This program represents the intelligence apparatus turning its tools inward. Declassified files reveal that the Central Intelligence Agency secretly recruited and paid over 400 journalists, editors, and publishers at major American news organizations.
Looked like national newspapers, wire services, television networks.
The biggest names in media.
How does that actually work mechanically? I mean, are they handing them cash in briefcases? Are they feeding them exact scripts?
It was more sophisticated than that. Intelligence officers would cultivate relationships with influential journalists. They would provide them with exclusive, classified briefings that inherently favored the CIA's perspective.
Access journalism.
Exactly. In other cases, they would literally draft articles or opinion pieces and have the journalists publish them under their own names. They established a network of assets within the media to ensure that the domestic narrative surrounding the Cold War, the perceived threat of communism, and the necessity of foreign interventions aligned perfectly with the objectives of the shadow state.
If you are sitting in the dark listening to this, I want you to truly process the implications of that.
Yeah.
Imagine waking up in 1956. You walk out to your porch, pick up the morning paper, and read the headlines to understand the reality of the world. You are completely unaware that the intelligence agencies of your own democratic government effectively wrote or heavily shaped the very articles molding your worldview.
It's chilling.
It is a level of psychological management of manufacturing consent that the West typically accused the Soviet Union of practicing.
It is the paradox of the security state. In the attempt to defeat totalitarianism, the apparatus adopted the methodologies of the totalitarian. This culture of absolute, unquestioned secrecy, combined with unlimited budgets and unchecked military paranoia, constructed a global machine that no single human being could fully comprehend or control.
No.
They built a doomsday architecture so complex that it developed its own momentum, repeatedly bringing the human race to the edge of the abyss.
Here's where it gets really interesting and deeply terrifying, because we have to talk about the moments the machine almost broke.
The near misses.
The moments when this cold, theoretical war almost turned unimaginably hot. The public consciousness usually gravitates to October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It remains the most heavily analyzed 13 days in modern history. The fundamental trigger was the discovery by American U-2 reconnaissance that the Soviet Union was secretly constructing launch pads for medium-range nuclear ballistic missiles on the island of Cuba.
Which is 90 miles from the American coast.
90 miles.
The narrative we are taught focuses on the intense diplomatic tension. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev engaged in this high-wire negotiation, carefully stepping back from the brink through back-channel diplomacy.
That's the public story.
Right. But the declassified reality of what was happening inside the White House cabinet room is far more volatile. Kennedy was essentially isolated. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most senior military commanders in the United States, were virtually unanimous in their advice. They were aggressively pushing the president to authorize immediate, massive bombing runs on the missile sites, followed by a full-scale amphibious invasion of Cuba.
The military logic was that allowing the missiles to become operational fundamentally altered the strategic balance of power, placing Washington, D.C. within a 5-minute strike window.
Yeah.
General Curtis LeMay, the formidable head of the Strategic Air Command, was particularly forceful. The transcripts show him directly comparing a decision to negotiate with Khrushchev to the appeasement of Adolf Hitler at Munich prior to World War II.
He viewed diplomacy as cowardice.
He did.
And we know now, from Soviet archives opened decades later, what would have happened if Kennedy had bowed to the pressure of his generals.
It would have been the end.
If American troops had stormed the beaches of Cuba, they would have been met with tactical nuclear weapons. Soviet field commanders on the island had been given the authority to use them to repel an invasion without needing to radio Moscow for permission.
They already had the authority.
An invasion would have guaranteed a nuclear exchange. But Kennedy holds the line. He negotiates the secret removal of American missiles in Turkey in exchange for the Soviet missiles leaving Cuba. But that diplomatic victory isn't what saved us.
No, the diplomatic resolution was happening in Washington and Moscow. But the fate of the world did not rest on the desks of politicians. It rested at the bottom of the ocean, precisely in the scenario we discussed at the beginning of this deep dive.
The Soviet submarine.
The B-59.
Let's examine the mechanics of that specific moment. Why was the B-59 isolated, and why were the Americans dropping explosives on it?
Well, the American naval blockade surrounding Cuba was tasked with forcing Soviet submarines to the surface for identification. The destroyers were dropping practice depth charges, essentially underwater flashbangs designed to signal the submarine to surface.
Right.
But the crew of the B-59, operating deep underwater, had no way of knowing these were non-lethal warnings. The sheer concussive force of a depth charge rattling a submarine hull feels like a lethal attack. Furthermore, the B-59's deep water antenna was damaged, and they'd been unable to receive radio transmissions for days. They were physically and psychologically severed from the world.
And their protocol for the 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo required the unanimous consent of the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov.
Exactly.
The captain and the political officer are convinced the war has started. They turn their keys. Arkhipov refuses. He uses logic, arguing that they have no confirmation of war and that surfacing to establish communication is the only rational action.
He held his ground.
A single man, acting against the chain of command, relying purely on his own moral intuition, prevents the launch. And as you mentioned earlier, Arkhipov returned to the Soviet Union and lived his entire life in obscurity. His name was hidden in classified files for 40 years.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, a chilling pattern emerges. The elaborate fail-safes, the rigid protocols, the trillion-dollar command and control systems built by the brightest strategists of both empires, these systems consistently failed.
They failed constantly.
When the crisis reached its peak, humanity was not saved by the architecture of deterrence. It was saved by individual human beings disobeying the logic of the machine.
Or in some cases, we were saved by literal, blind mechanical luck.
Yes.
I want to shift away from intentional human choices and look at the physical mechanics of the weapons themselves. The declassified files regarding an incident in Goldsboro, North Carolina in 1961 perfectly illustrate this. This is a year before the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The Goldsboro incident involves a B-52 Stratofortress bomber flying a routine airborne alert mission over the eastern seaboard of the United States.
Just a routine flight.
During the flight, the aircraft suffers a catastrophic structural failure. The right wing breaks off, the fuselage disintegrates in midair, and the bomber drops its payload. 2 live Mark 39 hydrogen bombs.
These are 4 megaton weapons.
Massive.
To put that into perspective, one of these bombs possesses more than 250 times the destructive power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And they are falling over North Carolina. As one of the bombs falls, the mechanical systems in sight react exactly as they were engineered to react when dropped from a plane. The parachute deploys, the firing mechanisms engage.
Because a nuclear weapon is designed with a sequential arming process to prevent accidental detonation. In the case of the Mark 39, there were 7 distinct steps that had to be completed to trigger the nuclear core. As this bomb descended over American soil, the centrifugal forces and the altitude sensors initiated the sequence. It progressed through step 1, step 2, all the way through step 6.
6 of the 7 steps.
The weapon was fully armed and charging the firing capacitors.
The only thing standing between a quiet rural landscape and a 4 megaton thermonuclear explosion was a single low voltage mechanical switch, the arm safe switch.
Yeah.
That one frayed wire mechanism somehow held its position upon impact with the ground. It is like living in a house wired with high explosives, trusting a state-of-the-art security panel, only to realize the safety mechanism is a piece of duct tape holding two wires apart.
It was not policy, diplomacy, or human intervention that saved the eastern seaboard of the United States from radioactive contamination. It was a single, cheap mechanical component that simply didn't fail.
Just blind luck.
And the profound secrecy of the Cold War meant that the United States government classified this near catastrophe, lying to the public about the danger of the broken arrow, for 52 years.
And the terror of relying on faulty mechanisms doesn't end in the 60s. Let's move forward into the 1980s.
Right.
The political climate is incredibly tense. The Soviet Union is bogged down in Afghanistan, the US is deploying new intermediate-range missiles in Europe, and the rhetoric is hostile. In September 1983, a Soviet lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov is sitting in a secret bunker outside Moscow, tasked with monitoring the OKO early warning satellite system.
The OKO system was designed to detect the thermal plumes of American ICBMs launching from their silos. At exactly 15 minutes past midnight, the system alarms triggered.
And what did it say?
The computer screens in the bunker indicated with the highest level of certainty that the United States had launched a single ICBM toward the Soviet Union. Shortly after, it reported a second launch, then a third, fourth, and fifth. The system was showing 5 inbound nuclear missiles.
I want to focus on the doctrine of launch on warning. This is the core operating logic of mutually assured destruction in the 1980s.
Yeah.
You do not wait for the enemy's missiles to detonate and destroy your command centers. If your computers tell you a launch has occurred, you immediately fire your own missiles in retaliation while they are still in the air. Petrov's strict orders were to report the incoming strike to the Soviet High Command, which almost certainly would have initiated an immediate, massive retaliatory launch against the West.
Petrov had to make a decision in minutes. He analyzed the data presented by a machine and he compared it against basic strategic logic.
Right.
He reasoned that if the United States were executing a preemptive nuclear strike, they would not launch 5 missiles. They would launch an overwhelming barrage of hundreds of missiles to decapitate the Soviet command structure. 5 missiles made no strategic sense. Furthermore, the ground-based radar systems, which looked over the horizon, were not yet showing any incoming targets.
He is sweating in this bunker, staring at the flashing red alerts, and he decides to trust his human intuition over the multi-billion ruble computer architecture.
He took an immense risk.
He picks up the phone and reports a system malfunction to his superiors. He essentially declares a false alarm, knowing that if he is wrong, his country will be vaporized in about 10 minutes, and they will have launched no retaliation. He just sits there waiting for the impact, and of course, nothing happens.
Subsequent investigations revealed the cause of the glitch. The satellite sensors had misinterpreted a rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds over North Dakota as the thermal signatures of missile launches.
Sunlight on clouds.
Sunlight on clouds. Once again, the survival of civilization hinged entirely on a single officer's willingness to disobey protocol. And just like Arkhipov, Petrov received no accolades. He was heavily interrogated, his career stalled, and the event was deeply classified.
It perfectly illustrates the fragility of the entire architecture. But later that exact same year, in November 1983, the fragility was tested from a different angle. Not a computer glitch, but a profound psychological miscalculation known as Able Archer 83.
By late 1983, the Soviet intelligence apparatus, the KGB, was operating under a heightened state of paranoia. They had initiated an intelligence gathering program called Operation Orion, specifically designed to detect signs that the United States was preparing a surprise nuclear first strike.
They were on edge.
They were interpreting routine political rhetoric as genuine preparations for war.
In the midst of this extreme Soviet paranoia, NATO conducts Able Archer 83. This was an annual command post exercise designed to simulate a coordinated nuclear release in Europe in the event of a conflict. But the 1983 iteration was far more realistic than previous years. Much more. It included new communication codes, radio silences, and the participation of heads of government.
And the Soviet intelligence analysts observing this exercise misread the signals entirely. Viewing the events through the lens of Operation Orion, they convinced themselves that Able Archer was not a simulation. They believed it was a sophisticated cover for a genuine preemptive strike.
The reaction on the Soviet side was immediate and terrifying. This wasn't just nervous men in a bunker. Entire divisions of the Soviet military went on high alert.
Right.
Nuclear-capable combat aircraft in East Germany and Poland were loaded with live munitions. Submarines were deployed. Elements of the Soviet ballistic missile force were placed on elevated launch readiness. The world stumbled right to the edge of the precipice, not because of a political standoff like Cuba, but because the psychological distrust was so absolute that a military training exercise almost provoked the reality it was simulating.
The complexity of the deterrence machine had created a feedback loop of terror. But while we focus heavily on the miraculous avoidance of a nuclear holocaust, we must confront a darker reality of the Cold War.
Yeah, we have to talk about the Proxy Wars.
The violence did not magically dissipate. The bloodshed was not avoided. It was simply outsourced. Because the superpowers could not fight each other directly without initiating Armageddon, they exported their violence to the developing world.
This is why the term Cold War feels deeply inadequate and, frankly, insulting to millions of people. It was only cold if you lived in Washington, London, or Moscow. If you lived in the global south, the war was brutally, devastatingly hot. We have to look at the mechanisms of these proxy wars.
Well, the underlying logic of the proxy war is deeply cynical. It operates on the domino theory.
Right.
The belief that if one nation in a region fell to communism, the surrounding nations would inevitably follow. Therefore, the superpowers funded, armed, and sometimes directly intervened in civil conflicts across the globe to maintain ideological control. Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, El Salvador.
In each of these nations, ordinary human beings, farmers, students, villagers, were subjected to unimaginable suffering, paying the ultimate price for the geopolitical chess match of two empires who refused to fight on their own soil. If you examine the Vietnam War alone, the scale of the human tragedy is staggering. The United States lost over 58,000 soldiers. The Vietnamese casualties, both military and civilian, are estimated at over 2 million.
2 million.
You have an entire country decimated, forests defoliated by Agent Orange, villages destroyed by napalm, all in the name of containing a political ideology thousands of miles from American shores.
And the archives reveal a profound systemic betrayal of the public trust regarding these conflicts. The release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, which were thousands of pages of top-secret Department of Defense analysis, provided undeniable proof that successive American administrations had systematically lied to Congress and the public about the progress and viability of the war in Vietnam.
Let's focus on President Lyndon B. Johnson. The declassified memos from his administration are just damning. By 1967, his own Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, privately concluded and informed the president that the military strategy was failing and the war was essentially unwinnable.
They knew it!
They knew the pacification efforts were collapsing. They knew the enemy could absorb the bombing campaigns.
Yet despite possessing this definitive, classified knowledge that the strategic objective was unachievable, the administration continued to deploy hundreds of thousands of combat troops. They continued to draft young American men and send them into the jungles of Southeast Asia.
Johnson privately acknowledged the futility, but he chose to continue the slaughter for 4 more years, simply to avoid the political embarrassment of being the first American president to lose a war.
Yeah.
He traded thousands of human lives for domestic political optics. It is an absolute, fundamental betrayal of the democratic principles the war was supposedly fought to defend.
This contrast highlights the immense cynicism of the era. You had politicians delivering soaring ideological rhetoric about the survival of the free world and the absolute necessity of shared sacrifice. But behind the curtain, the institutions managing the conflict were often driven by much darker, baser motives. Nowhere is this disconnect more jarring than in the Shadow War, the world of counterintelligence and espionage.
If the proxy wars represent the cynical expenditure of human life for ideology, the espionage files represent the complete abandonment of ideology for banal greed. We need to talk about Aldrich Ames because the mechanics of his treason are just mind-boggling.
Aldrich Ames was not a peripheral figure. He was a highly placed senior officer within the Central Intelligence Agency, specifically tasked with counterintelligence operations against the Soviet Union. His job was to identify and recruit Soviet intelligence officers to spy for the United States and to protect American assets operating behind the Iron Curtain.
So the man whose literal job description is protecting American spies in Moscow is the one selling them out. How does he even execute a betrayal of that magnitude?
He utilized his immense internal access. He simply walked into the CIA's file rooms, gathered the names and identities of virtually every human source the United States had cultivated within the Soviet military and intelligence apparatus, placed them in briefcases or plastic bags, and walked out.
Just walked out with them.
He then passed these highly classified lists to his KGB handlers through a series of dead drops around Washington, D.C.
He hands them the entire roster. And the immediate consequence of that action is the systematic rounding up of at least 10 human beings, men who were risking their lives working for the United States. They are arrested, interrogated, and executed by the Soviets. Ames signs their death warrants. And we have to ask the critical question, why? Was he a committed Marxist? Did he suffer a crisis of conscience regarding American foreign policy? No. He did it for cash. He received approximately $2.7 million from the KGB over several years.
The absolute banality of his motivation is staggering. He traded the lives of 10 men and compromised the national security of his country so he could purchase a larger house in the suburbs and drive a luxury Jaguar.
The Jaguar.
The disconnect between the high-stakes global standoff and the petty greed of the men managing it is a recurring theme in the archives.
And Ames was not an isolated incident. Look at Robert Hansen.
Robert Hansen was an FBI agent whose career spanned over 2 decades. Like Ames, Hansen's specific mandate was counterintelligence catching foreign spies operating within the United States. And for 22 years, while working inside the FBI and later the State Department, Hansen functioned as a highly productive mole for the Soviet Union and subsequently the Russian Federation.
22 years. How does the premier law enforcement agency in the world fail to notice that one of their own counterintelligence experts is systematically dismantling their operations for over 2 decades?
Hansen was incredibly methodical. He never met his handlers in person. He communicated entirely through encrypted messages and dead drops in parks around Virginia. He sold an unimaginably vast volume of sensitive data.
He sold everything.
He compromised the continuity of government plans,
which are the highly classified protocols detailing where the president and senior leadership would be evacuated in the event of a nuclear strike.
Right. He handed over details on sophisticated electronic surveillance technologies, and he exposed the identities of several double agents.
The damage was so extensive that when Soviet intelligence officers were later debriefed, they admitted they found it difficult to believe that a single individual could possess such wide-ranging access. Hansen compromised the very blueprints of American nuclear survival. And returning briefly to the British side, we discussed Kim Philby earlier.
Yes.
Philby maintained his cover far longer than the initial post-war years. He rose through the ranks of MI6 to become the head of the anti-Soviet section. The man actively hunting Soviet spies in the UK was reporting directly to Moscow.
He finally defected to the Soviet Union in 1963 as the counterintelligence net slowly closed around him. When you synthesize the cases of Philby, Ames, and Hansen, a grim reality emerges. The massive globe-spanning apparatus of Western intelligence, which projected an aura of complete invincibility and omnipotence, was structurally hollowed out. The rot was deep inside the foundation.
But the rot wasn't exclusive to the West. The systemic decay was spreading fundamentally through the very core of the Soviet Empire, leading to an ending that virtually no intelligence agency accurately predicted. For decades, the accepted doctrine in Washington was that the Cold War was a permanent state of affairs.
They thought it would never end.
Right, ending only in an apocalyptic nuclear exchange or a perpetual endless standoff extending centuries.
But by the mid-1980s, the underlying mathematics of the conflict caught up with the Soviet Union. The state was collapsing from within, not due to military defeat on a battlefield, but due to the inherent contradictions of a command economy attempting to maintain parity in a global arms race.
Let's explain the mechanics of that collapse. A command economy dictates exactly what factories produce, based on central government quotas, rather than market demand. For 40 years, the Soviet leadership prioritized the military-industrial complex above all else.
I love everything.
They successfully built thousands of nuclear warheads, they launched the first satellite into space, they maintained a massive standing army, and they deployed fleets of nuclear-powered submarines across the world's oceans.
But the economic cost of that military parity was the absolute devastation of domestic infrastructure. The factories were churning out tanks and ICBMs, but they were fundamentally failing to produce consumer goods.
Right.
The agricultural sector was incredibly inefficient. By the 1980s, you had a superpower capable of mapping the dark side of the moon, yet in Moscow and Leningrad, ordinary citizens were standing in lines for hours, braving freezing temperatures just to secure basic necessities like a loaf of bread, shoes, or toilet paper.
It is the ultimate irony of the Cold War. An empire with the physical capability to annihilate human civilization 50 times over was quietly crumbling because it could not figure out how to feed its own people. The sheer economic strain of trying to match the Reagan administration's massive military buildup was the final breaking point.
This systemic crisis leads to the elevation of Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1985. Gorbachev belonged to a new generation of leadership. He recognized the profound rot within the system. He understood that the Soviet economy was stagnating and the technological gap with the West was widening uncontrollably.
And Gorbachev's intention was not to destroy the Soviet Union. His intention was to save it. He introduces two fundamental reform policies: glasnost and perestroika. Let's look at how these policies operated. Perestroika translates to restructuring.
It was an attempt to introduce limited market-like reforms and efficiency into the stagnant command economy.
Right. But it's glasnost that truly changes the world.
Glasnost translates to openness or transparency. For the first time in decades, the Soviet state permitted a degree of freedom of speech. They allowed the press to report on government failures, they released political dissidents, and they acknowledged historical atrocities committed by the state.
But here is the fundamental mechanical flaw in Gorbachev's logic. He believed he could modernize Soviet communism, make it more humane and efficient. What he failed to grasp was that the entire Soviet architecture, the entire apparatus stretching across Eastern Europe, was held together by only two elements:
state violence and absolute fear.
Yes, the system did not function on consensus, it functioned on terror.
When you introduce the concept of openness into a rigid system built entirely on state control, suppression of truth, and historical lies, you do not reform the system. You dissolve the glue holding it together. Like a massive star collapsing under its own gravity once its internal fuel is exhausted, the removal of fear caused the entire Soviet sphere to instantly destabilize.
And once the fear of the Red Army evaporated, the dominoes fell with breathtaking speed. Not in Southeast Asia, but in the very buffer states Stalin had demanded back in 1945. The citizens of Eastern Europe realized that Gorbachev was not going to send tanks into their capitals to crush protests as previous Soviet leaders had done. Poland held free elections and broke away. Then Hungary opened its borders. Then Czechoslovakia.
The physical manifestation of this collapse occurred on November 9, 1989. The Berlin Wall, the literal concrete barrier that had divided Europe and served as the starkest symbol of the Iron Curtain, was swarmed by ordinary citizens. Armed with sledgehammers and pickaxes, the people tore the wall down, while border guards simply stood by, unwilling to fire.
The speed of the unraveling shocked everyone in Washington, and it culminated just 2 years later. On December 25, 1991, Christmas Day, Mikhail Gorbachev went on national television and formally resigned. The Soviet flag, the hammer and sickle that had defined global geopolitics for nearly half a century, was quietly lowered over the Kremlin for the final time. The Soviet Union ceased to exist, splintering into independent republics.
46 years of global conflict officially concluded, not with a nuclear exchange, but with a bureaucratic dissolution. But the end of the Soviet state does not mean the end of the Cold War's impact.
So what does this all mean? When you look at the totality of the archives we've explored tonight, you have to recognize that the modern world we live in is deeply imprinted by those 46 years. The massive budgets of our intelligence agencies, our foreign policy doctrines, the deep-seated cultural paranoia regarding state surveillance, it was all forged in the crucible of that shadow war. The declassified records force us to confront the fact that hundreds of millions of lives were permanently altered. Dozens of secret illegal operations were run with absolute impunity, and the public was subjected to systemic deception by the very institutions sworn to protect them.
We live within the psychological and physical architecture built during those decades. But the most striking takeaway from reading the primary sources is the profound injustice of the historical narrative that survived.
It is entirely upside down. The men who actually preserved human civilization, Vasily Arkhipov, sweating in a submerged tin can, calmly refusing to authorize a nuclear torpedo. Stanislav Petrov, staring at a blaring computer screen, ignoring the sirens, and relying on his own human intuition to prevent a retaliatory strike.
True heroes.
These men died in obscurity. They received no parades, no official recognition or medals from their governments while they were alive, and yet the politicians and the generals who continually pushed the world to the absolute edge of annihilation, the men who lied to the public to justify proxy wars, the men who traded thousands of lives for political capital, They have libraries, aircraft carriers, and monuments dedicated in their honor.
It forces you to completely reevaluate your understanding of leadership, heroism, and the reliability of the official historical record. The overarching theme of the Cold War is that the public was systematically kept in the dark about the U-2 flights, about the realities of Vietnam, about the hiring of war criminals, and most terrifyingly, about how incredibly close the world came to nuclear immolation on multiple occasions.
No.
The vast majority of people who lived through the Cold War went to their graves, never knowing that their survival often relied on nothing more than a frayed wire in North Carolina or a single rebellious Soviet officer.
And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with. We have spent this deep dive walking through the declassified documents, shedding light on the secrets that have finally been released to the public. The B-59 submarine, Operation Mockingbird, the Goldsboro bomber crash. But the source material notes something explicitly at the very end. It states that thousands upon thousands of documents from the Cold War remain heavily classified today, decades after the Soviet Union disappeared from the map.
Thousands of them.
If the United States government was willing to hide the fact that a single, cheap mechanical switch was the only thing that prevented a 4-megaton hydrogen bomb from detonating over American soil, and they managed to successfully keep that a secret for 52 years, what exactly is sitting in those boxes that are still classified right now? What terrifying near misses, what dark psychological operations, what devastating betrayals from the 1970s or the 1980s are still locked away in subterranean vaults, just waiting for the day they are declassified to fundamentally rewrite our understanding of the world we currently live in. If a peace built on lies is a poisoned chalice, we have to wonder how much of that poison we are still drinking today without even realizing it.
That is the question we have to ask ourselves.
Thank you for joining us in the dark tonight on this deep dive into the shadows of the Cold War. Keep questioning the official record, sleep well, and keep seeking the truth.